I woke up to chainsaws tearing through the dark. Not one, dozens, all at once. I bolted outside barefoot, heart slamming, and stopped cold. My red oaks were coming down, one by one, the trees I planted the year my daughter learned to walk. 15 years of summer barbecues, rope swings, and Sunday mornings, hitting the ground like they never mattered. Behind the crew stood a woman, clipboard, that smug smile of someone who thinks they've already won. Before I could speak, she got there first.
We've got an easement. Your trees block the new water line. It's done. Thanks for cooperating.
She turned away before I could answer. What she didn't know, the lake sitting right next to the trench they were digging, the one they were tapping for the whole neighborhood. Every single drop is mine. And that morning, they handed me everything I needed to shut it all down. What would you do? Drop it in the comments. And tell me where you're watching from. My grandfather called this county home for 40 years. My family calls me Colt, and for the past 18 years, I've called this 22 acres of Texas hill country mine. The property sits in the hill country of central Texas, maybe 40 minutes outside Boerne. Out here you smell cedar and limestone dust, not car exhaust. In early morning, the air has that cold, mineral bite that tells you water is close. A reminder that the land knows things about itself that don't show up on any map. I bought it in my early 30s, back when the price was still honest. 22 acres with a natural spring-fed lake sitting dead in the middle of it. Maybe 3 acres of open water, but it runs deep and clear and fills every summer like it's got a secret budget somewhere underground. My grandfather had worked cattle on neighboring land for decades. When this parcel came up for sale, our family pooled together and made it happen. I built my house on the eastern ridge above the water. Nothing fancy. A low ranch style with a wide porch and a stone chimney my father helped me mortar in by hand. Every window faces the lake. I planted red oaks and live oaks along the southern boundary, partly for shade, partly because I liked the idea of something outliving me. By the time those trees hit 30 feet tall, they formed a wall of green that kept the property private from the road below. The year my daughter was learning to walk, I planted the last of them. We'd eat breakfast on the porch, and she'd point at the biggest oak like it was an old friend. I didn't think much about that detail at the time. I would think about it constantly later. Then the development company arrived. The HOA called itself the Ridgecrest Harmony Association, which, honestly, sounds like a retirement community for people who really enjoy passive-aggressive notes slid under doors. It was formed to manage a new subdivision of about 90 homes going up on the land directly adjacent to mine. The developer carved roads, graded the hillside flat, and started building identical beige houses with 2-car garages and HOA-mandated mailboxes positioned at 6-inch intervals. Every house looked like it had been photocopied from the same original blueprint, slightly reduced each time. The HOA's president was a woman named Brenda, 50-something, highlighted hair frozen in a style that peaked around 2004, always in a vest with too many pockets, the kind of vest that signals a person has organized their gear for an emergency that will never come. Brenda had been a mid-level manager at a regional insurance company before retiring early, and she had taken every single management impulse from that career and poured it straight into homeowner governance. If bureaucracy were a religion, Brenda would be commissioning cathedrals and writing the hymnal. The first move came about 3 years after the subdivision opened. I got a certified letter, which is always a delightful way to start a Tuesday morning, informing me that my southern fence line encroached on a planned easement corridor the association intended to use for a shared water pipeline connecting to the county system. The letter was 4 pages long. 3.5 pages were legal boilerplate about community enhancement and collaborative infrastructure. The half page that actually mattered said the HOA was asserting a prescriptive easement claim based on usage, specifically that their landscaping crews had mowed along my fence line for 2 years. Here's the first thing you need to understand. A prescriptive easement is basically the legal version of, I've been doing this long enough that it's mine now. Like adverse possession, but for usage rights rather than ownership. Mowing a strip of grass along someone else's fence doesn't establish that, not even close. In Texas, you need 10 continuous years of open, hostile, adverse use. But Brenda's HO, a lawyer, was apparently betting I wouldn't know the difference. I read the letter twice, set it on my kitchen table next to my coffee mug, looked out at the lake for a long time. I wasn't panicking, but I was paying attention in a way I hadn't been before. That was the moment the game started. And like most games worth playing, neither side fully understood the board yet. I didn't respond to the certified letter right away. Not because I was ignoring it, I was documenting it. I photographed the envelope, the postmarks, every single page in sequence, labeled the folder with the date and the word exhibit in capital letters. Then I called an old college friend named Wade Pressler, who'd gone into real estate law down in San Antonio. Wade had the voice and temperament of a man who had spent 2 decades personally enjoying the act of defeating people in court. Dry, deliberate, never alarmed. "They've got nothing," he told me over the phone. 2 years of lawn mowing doesn't make an easement. In Texas, that requires 10 years of open, continuous, hostile, and adverse use. They're either bluffing or they're incompetent, possibly both. So I do nothing? You send a formal denial letter, I'll draft it. You deny the easement claim on record, establish the date. That stops the clock on any future adverse claim, even if they decide to try and build one over the next decade. The letter went out the following week, certified mail, return receipt requested. Wade's legal writing had a particular quality, pleasant and professional on the surface, absolutely merciless underneath, the way a stiletto looks like a letter opener until it very suddenly doesn't. Brenda's response came 11 days later. This time, it wasn't a letter, it was a county filing. She had hired a surveying firm to produce a survey claiming a possible discrepancy between the original land grant description and the current recorded plat. That surveying firm, I noted carefully, contracted frequently with the HOA's developer. In plain terms, she was trying to manufacture uncertainty about where my property line actually was. This move sounds complicated, but the logic is simple. If you can create doubt about where the property line falls, you cloud the title, making the land harder to sell, harder to refinance, and functionally harder to use until the dispute resolves. It's not illegal on its face. Surveys can genuinely disagree, but commissioning one from a connected firm specifically to generate legal leverage against a neighbor you're already in a dispute with, that's the kind of maneuver that makes opposing attorneys actually look forward to Monday morning. I hired my own surveyor, not the cheap option. I paid for a licensed land surveyor named Rupert Oakes, 30 years in the field, a reputation for exactness that verged on personal philosophy, and the unhurried confidence of a man who had watched people fight over property lines his entire career and found the whole enterprise faintly amusing. He smelled of surveyor's chalk and equipment oil and spent 2 full days on my land with a transit, a laptop, and what appeared to be a personal grudge against imprecision. Rupert cross-referenced the original Spanish land grant documents, the county plat records, and the deed chain going back to 1887. His survey didn't just refute the HOA's position, it established my fence line as sitting 18 inches inside my actual, recorded boundary, meaning their landscaping crews had been mowing my land, not theirs. The adverse use claim, already weak, was now provably backwards. But Rupert also flagged something else. A small notation buried in deed language from a 1961 conveyance. He circled it in pencil, raised one eyebrow, and said in the particular tone of a man who has found exactly what he expected to find, "You'll want to read that language carefully." I read it carefully. Then I read it again. Then I called Wade. But before I could even explain what Rupert had found, something else happened that changed the whole temperature of everything. I came home from a supply run to find 3 of my oaks on the ground, not fallen, cut. The stumps were fresh, still weeping sap that smelled like a forest distilled to its essence, sharp and sweet and irreversible. Orange spray paint marked the cuts. A laminated notice, stapled to the nearest stump, explained that the Ridgecrest Harmony Association had exercised its Emergency Vegetation Management Authority under a county ordinance. One it claimed applied to vegetation blocking utility infrastructure corridors. The problem was that no infrastructure corridor had been legally established. There was no valid easement. There was no demolition permit. There was no legal basis of any kind. There was only Brenda's interpretation of an ordinance that did not mean what she said it meant, applied to land she had no legal authority to touch. I stood in my own dirt while sawdust still drifted on the afternoon breeze, and felt something cold and clear settle over me. Not rage exactly, something sharper. The kind of focus that arrives when everything suddenly snaps into relief. When you realize you've been watching a situation casually, and it's time to stop doing that. I photographed everything, every stump, every cut surface, the spray paint, the laminated notice, the equipment tire tracks still pressed into the soil. 17 photographs in 10 minutes. Then I walked down the ridge to my lake, looked at the pipeline trench they had begun digging along the southern shore, and remembered what Rupert had circled in the 1961 deed. I called Wade that evening. He listened without interrupting, asked 4 or 5 precise questions, and then made a sound I had never heard from him before, somewhere between a sharp exhale and a laugh that he was trying to keep professional. Walk me through this again. They cut trees on your property without a valid easement, without a demolition permit, and with zero legal basis. 3 of them, red oaks. I planted those trees 30 years ago, 64-inch circumference on the largest one. In Texas, unauthorized destruction of trees over 6 inches in diameter is a civil liability. You can recover replacement value plus any diminution in property value. A certified arborist calculates it based on species, size, age, and condition. For 30-year red oaks, Colt, that number is going to be very substantial. One thing to know here, in most U.S. states, you can sue for tree replacement value, not just the market price of a sapling from a nursery, but the actual cost to grow an equivalent mature tree. For hardwoods that take decades to reach full size, that figure runs into tens of thousands of dollars per tree. It's one of those legal rights most property owners never know they have until the day they need it. I hired the arborist the next morning. Her name was Cheryl Graves, and she drove up in a truck with a hand-painted leaf logo on the door that I immediately found reassuring. She spent most of the day measuring stump diameters, cross-referencing species records, and typing notes into a tablet she handled with the focused efficiency of someone who has done this 1,000 times and takes every single one seriously. She used the Council of Tree and Landscape Appraisers Guide for plant appraisal, the industry standard methodology for tree valuation in legal disputes. Her total for 3 trees, $64,000. I'll give you a moment with that number, $64,000, for a woman who thought she was just clearing brush from a fence line. But while the arborist assessment was moving through the system, Brenda made her next move. She called an emergency HOA board meeting, posted notice exactly 48 hours prior, the legal minimum, almost certainly not a coincidence, and pushed through a resolution authorizing the pipeline project to continue, citing an established corridor claim currently under county review. There was no established claim. There was a disputed survey that Wade had already filed a formal objection to. The resolution passed 3-2. By the following Monday morning, the pipeline crew was back. The trench along my lake's southern bank was 2 feet deep and moving east. The foreman waved a laminated copy of the HOA resolution at me, like a hall pass from a substitute teacher. Here's where everything pivots. The crew had assumed, as almost anyone would, that a lake sitting entirely within private property is simply part of that property. Usually true, not always, and definitely not here. The 1961 deed language Rupert had flagged came from a water rights conveyance attached to the title when the county established its first rural water district. The clause stated that the natural spring-fed impoundment known as Hargrove Lake, yes, my lake had a proper name, and that name was in the deed, was conveyed with all water rights, water volumes, and hydraulic access pertaining thereto, to the owner of the tract in fee simple. Let me translate that out of 1961 legal drafting. Fee simple means outright, unconditional ownership. All water rights, water volumes, and hydraulic access means I don't just own the land surrounding the lake, I own the water itself, the spring feeding it, the volume it holds, and critically, the right to control who draws from it, diverts it, connects infrastructure to it, or benefits from its proximity. In Texas, water law is a universe of its own. Groundwater and surface water operate under entirely different legal frameworks, and navigating them requires specialists. But there are historical private ownership provisions for certain spring-fed impoundments that predate the modern regulatory framework, and the Hargrove Lake Clause was one of them. Recorded, filed, sitting quietly in the county deed records for 63 years, unbothered, waiting for exactly this moment. Key takeaway: if your property is near any natural water feature, a spring, a creek, a pond, Pull your deed and read the water rights language carefully. In Texas and parts of the western United States, private ownership claims on spring-fed impoundments can override standard surface water regulations, and most landowners have no idea they hold them. I filed formal notices of private water rights claim with the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, the County Engineer's Office, and the State Water Resources Division. Every filing included the deed language. Every filing noted that the HOA's pipeline was being routed adjacent to a privately owned water source without any authorization from that owner. I did all of this without calling Brenda, without writing any letters to the association, and without explaining my next move to anyone. I just filed, and then I went back to my porch and watched the lake in the late afternoon light, the way my grandfather taught me to watch land, like it has something to tell you if you're patient enough to listen. The first sign my filings were landing came about 2 weeks later, a black Ford pickup parked at the end of my driveway at 7 in the morning. Two men in polo shirts with County Infrastructure Division badges stepped out and asked if they could walk the property line with me. I said sure. We walked for 90 minutes. I answered every question, showed them every document I had, and was polite, precise, and gave them nothing to push back on. The kind of meeting where you're not trying to win. You're just being the most prepared person in the field. 3 days after that visit, the pipeline crew didn't show up to work. Brenda, to absolutely no one's surprise, did not quietly fold. She showed up at the county commissioner's court meeting and presented what she framed as a public safety emergency. The subdivision's water infrastructure was being obstructed by a frivolous property dispute that was putting 90 families at risk of compromised water supply come summer. She described me as a rural property holder attempting to block community development, using a legal maneuver she called spurious. She didn't mention the 3 trees she'd had cut without authorization, didn't mention the surveying firm's relationship with the developer, didn't mention the CC and R vote requirements she'd bypassed. She had done enough homework to know the water rights claim was real, so she decided to go around it rather than through it, which is a strategy that works right up until it doesn't. One of the commissioners, a third-term man named Dennis Polk, who had known Brenda through the Regional Chamber of Commerce for a solid decade, asked the county council whether there was a mechanism to override private water rights claims in the interest of public infrastructure. The county council, a precise and thoroughly unimpressed woman who looked like she had not lost an argument since approximately the 2nd grade, paused for a measured moment and said, "Not without a condemnation proceeding and fair market compensation to the property owner." Brenda said condemnation sounded just fine to her. Now, condemnation, eminent domain, whatever you want to call it, is the government's power to take private property for public use. But it requires fair market value compensation. The process runs through the courts, and depending on the complexity of the claim, it can take months to years. For an HOA trying to get a water project finished before summer heat set in, that timeline was genuinely catastrophic. Brenda was betting the threat of condemnation would pressure me into negotiating a fast settlement. It did not pressure me into anything. What it did was catch the attention of a reporter named Gail Murchison at the Bernie Star, who had been covering county commissioners' meetings for 11 years and had developed a well-documented professional fondness for HOA overreach stories. Gail had the county council's condemnation comment in print within 48 hours. The headline read, "County weighs condemnation for HOA pipeline. Landowners' private water rights in dispute." The story mentioned the tree removal in the 3rd paragraph. By the time most people finished reading it, they had formed a fairly clear opinion about who was in the right. The Bernie Star's comments section logged over 200 responses in the first 24 hours. The majority weren't kind to the HOA. One commenter who identified themselves as a retired water rights attorney from Houston explained in careful, plain terms why condemning a private spring-fed lake for a non-municipal HOA water project would be legally aggressive, unlikely to succeed, and guaranteed to set precedent that nobody in county government actually wanted to deal with. Wade texted me at 6 the next morning. One word: beautiful. Meanwhile, I'd been doing something quieter and more important. I'd been talking to my neighbors, not casually, specifically. The long-term rural landholders in the county, who had been watching the subdivision development with the particular patient suspicion of people who had watched this movie before. Development arrives, promises coexistence, wins a few permit battles, and then gradually reorders the local regulatory environment in its own favor. A neighbor named Prentice Dahl, a retired civil engineer with 30 years of infrastructure project experience and a methodical mind that never fully clocked out, pulled up the county's filed pipeline application, publicly accessible, anyone can request it, and noticed that the planned route ran through a floodplain buffer zone requiring a FEMA elevation certificate for any permanent infrastructure installation. No certificate had been filed with the county, not even an application. Another neighbor, Orvella Finch, who ran grass-fed beef cattle on her family land and had been receiving HOA complaints about livestock smell for 3 consecutive years, had a thick folder she'd been building quietly. It documented a clear pattern. The association consistently applied regulatory pressure against original rural landowners while extending informal accommodations to newer subdivision residents facing equivalent issues. 2 sets of rules. The old-timers got the hard version. I was beginning to understand that I wasn't just fighting a water pipeline. I was sitting at the center of something bigger and longer running than I'd realized, and it was time to start acting accordingly. Wade submitted a formal request for the full HOA governing documents under the Texas HOA Transparency Act, a 2021 state law requiring associations to produce financial records, bylaws, meeting minutes, and governing documents within defined timeframes. It's one of the most useful tools available to anyone dealing with an out-of-control HOA board, and most people have never heard of it. Brenda sent the documents over without hesitation, apparently confident there was nothing in there worth worrying about. She was wrong about that. The association's original Declaration of Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions, the CC&Rs, which is the foundational legal document defining what an HOA can and cannot do, had been drafted in 2006 when the subdivision was first platted. Section 7, Paragraph 3, under the heading Infrastructure Improvements, contained a clause that the original developer had apparently included as a protection for homeowners, and that no one had thought to remove. In plain summary, any infrastructure project requiring access to or easement across properties outside the platted subdivision boundary required the affirmative vote of 75% of all HOA members, not board members, not a simple majority, 3/4 of the entire homeowner membership. Brenda's emergency board resolution had received 3 votes out of 5 board members. The full HOA membership was 92 homeowners. 75% of 92 is 69 votes required. She had 3. The entire pipeline project, every tree cut, every trench dug, every dollar spent, had been authorized by a resolution that was, under the HOA's own governing documents, completely and entirely invalid from the moment it passed. Key takeaway here. HOA CC&Rs are legally binding contracts between the organization and every homeowner. When a board acts outside the authority defined in those documents, it doesn't just create a procedural problem. It creates personal liability for the board members who approve the action, and organizational liability for any damages that result. This is why reading your CC&Rs is not optional. It's financial self-defense. The financial records revealed a second problem. The pipeline project had been partially funded through a special infrastructure reserve assessment collected from homeowners the previous fall. The board's authorization memo cited authority under Section 5 of the CC&Rs, but Section 5 only permitted special assessments for maintenance of existing infrastructure. Building new infrastructure and routing it across neighboring private property was an entirely separate category requiring full member vote. The assessment had been collected without proper authorization for a project approved without proper authorization. In practical terms, 92 families had paid money into a fund that was improperly collected to build a project improperly approved, which had then been used to destroy trees and dig trenches on private property without a legal easement. That isn't a procedural oversight. That is a cascade of liability, and every link in that chain had a dollar amount attached to it. Wade and I went through all of it at my kitchen table on a quiet October afternoon. Outside the window, the lake held the late-season light in long, flat ribbons across its surface. The stumps were still visible at the tree line. I had been leaving them deliberately, documented, photographed, unremoved, as a permanent record of the specific moment Brenda's confidence outpaced her judgment. "What do we do now?" I asked. Wade tapped his pen on the table in a slow, deliberate rhythm. He had the expression of a man who has been waiting for exactly this kind of hand. "We let them dig just a little deeper first," he said. "There's a particular satisfaction in watching someone dig their own grave, especially when you've decided, quietly and deliberately, to hand them a bigger shovel." November came in cold and smelling of cedar smoke and wet limestone. The pipeline crew had resumed work after a 2-week pause, apparently reassured by someone in the county that the project was still viable. They worked steadily every weekday morning. The trench along my lake's southern bank grew longer by increments. I watched from my porch with a thermos of coffee and logged every session in a running document: date, crew size, trench extension, photographs time-stamped and filed. Wade filed the civil suit against the Ridgecrest Harmony Association, and Brenda Thatch personally, in her capacity as board president. The complaint alleged unauthorized destruction of trees. 3 counts: $64,000 per Cheryl Graves's arborist appraisal, plus trespass, and violation of the HOA's own CC&Rs. It also included a motion for injunctive relief to halt the pipeline project pending resolution of the underlying claims. The trespass claim matters more than it might seem at first. Once you establish that someone has repeatedly, knowingly entered your property and caused damage after you have explicitly denied permission in writing, the damages stop being limited to the physical cost of what was destroyed. You move into punitive territory, meaning the court can award damages above and beyond actual losses, specifically to punish the conduct and deter it from happening again. Wade filed for actual damages, attorney's fees, and a punitive multiplier. Total prayer for relief on the complaint, $312,000. According to a neighbor who happened to be nearby when the process server showed up, Brenda stood on her front porch reading the first page of the complaint for approximately 90 seconds without moving or speaking, which is, I'll note, a longer reaction time than the circumstances really warranted. But my planning went deeper than the lawsuit. I'd been working with Prentice on the pipeline's actual physical design. He pulled the engineering specs from the county filing, public record, available to anyone who asks, and identified something the HOA's contractor had apparently glossed over. The pipeline was designed to run under a section of ground that, during significant rainfall events, sits within my lake's natural overflow boundary. That ground floods periodically. Water pipes installed in repeatedly saturated and drained soil, without proper sleeving and bedding, develop joint failures over time. And a joint failure in a water main running adjacent to a documented private water source, my spring-fed lake, would trigger a contamination liability event under both state and federal environmental regulations. I didn't touch anything. Didn't need to. I hired a licensed civil engineer to formally document the design deficiency in a written report and filed that report with the county engineer's office and the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality as a potential water resource hazard notification. Under TCEQ rules, that notification required a mandatory design review before the county could grant final installation approval. Minimum review timeline, 60 days. The pipeline crew went home. Meanwhile, Orvella had been doing something I hadn't asked her to but deeply appreciated. She'd started a private email thread among about 30 rural landowners across the county, sharing Gale's Bernie Star article and a plain language summary of the CC&R supermajority violations. The thread grew to 60 people within 2 weeks. Among them were landowners with documented complaints of their own. A rancher cited for a visual obstruction created by his hay barn, a woman who received a landscaping demand letter referencing an ordinance that hadn't applied to agricultural zoned land for 11 years, a retired couple who had been pressured to remove a fence that turned out to be entirely on their own property. Prentice compiled everything into a 40-page report titled Pattern of Regulatory Overreach, Ridgecrest Harmony Association 2018 to 2024. Methodical, sourced, cross-referenced. He printed 50 copies, gave one to Gale Murchison at the Star, and held the rest for a specific occasion that was still a few weeks out. For my part, I was working on the final piece of the strategy, the element that would close the trap completely and give everyone, including the 90 families in the subdivision, a path through this that actually worked. I kept it quiet. Even Wade didn't have the full picture yet. In early December, I made 3 phone calls. one to Claudette Riggs, a water rights attorney in Austin with 25 years of experience in negotiated easement transactions, who came recommended by two different lawyers Wade trusted, one to the county water district director, and one to the Ridgecrest HOA's property management company. Not Brenda, but the hired professional administrators who ran the operational side of the association and who, I suspected, were quietly exhausted by all of this. I told the property manager I was open to discussing a resolution. I gave her a date, a time, and a location. The location was the county commissioner's public hearing room. In the stretch between my phone calls and the hearing date, Brenda made a series of moves that were ambitious in their creativity and catastrophic in their execution. The first was a smear campaign. She posted in the neighborhood's online HOA forum, technically a private platform, but with 92 member households, it functioned exactly like a small-town public square, accusing me of attempting to exploit legal loopholes to block community water access for personal financial gain. She described me as hostile to neighborhood growth and called on residents to contact their county commissioner to voice concern about bad faith landowners obstructing essential services. Some residents did make those calls. What Brenda apparently hadn't anticipated was that roughly a third of the people who called weren't calling to complain about me. They were calling to ask why their special assessment had been collected without a proper membership vote. Several had read the Star article. A few had read the CC and Rs for the first time in years. The forum post was screenshotted within the hour and forwarded to Wade. He printed it, labeled it Defamation and Harassment, Exhibit A, and slid it into the growing file. When you are already named as a defendant in a civil suit seeking $312,000 in damages, posting public accusations about the plaintiff's motives is not a legally sound strategy. It is, however, a very efficient way to improve the plaintiff's case. Brenda's second move was to file a complaint with the county assessor's office, requesting a review of my agricultural property tax exemption. In Texas, rural landowners can qualify for significant property tax reductions by maintaining qualifying agricultural use, cattle, timber management, wildlife management, and similar activities. She claimed my 22 acres didn't meet the minimum qualifying standard and suggested the exemption had been improperly maintained. I had held a wildlife management exemption for 11 years. Every annual report, every qualifying activity log, every required filing, documented, stamped, and organized in a binder I could locate in under 2 minutes. The assessor's office reviewed Brenda's complaint, examined my records, and closed the case within 3 weeks with no action. But the complaint itself became public record the moment she filed it. Wade added it to the amended complaint as additional evidence of a sustained pattern of regulatory harassment. Every bad faith move she made was another brick in the case we were building. The third move was the most consequential, and the one that ultimately cost Brenda the most, personally. She had a conversation with an administrative staffer in Commissioner Polk's office, in which she suggested that the county might find future infrastructure permitting processes more cooperative if the commissioner were to take an active interest in facilitating a resolution to the ongoing water rights dispute. The staffer, to their significant credit, documented the conversation in writing the same day. That documentation would eventually be produced under a public records request. The word the staffer used to describe the conversation, when later asked about it under oath, was pressure. That word has a specific legal meaning when it appears in the context of a public official and an infrastructure permitting decision. I didn't know the details of this conversation in real time. I was focused on what I could directly control. 3 evenings a week, I was at Orvella's kitchen table with Prentice and a retired CPA named Herschel Drake, a man who had farmed in the county for 30 years and now consulted on small business accounting with the particular thoroughness of someone who has seen what happens when records aren't kept carefully. Together, we were working through the HOA's financial documents, all of which had been produced in civil discovery. What we found wasn't one smoking gun. It was a mosaic. Assessment funds spent on board member expenses that couldn't be verified as legitimate HOA business. A landscaping maintenance contract awarded to a company owned by the husband of a board member, without any competitive bid process. Travel reimbursements submitted by Brenda for what she described as HOA governance conferences in locations that coincided, with notable consistency, with long holiday weekends. None of it was necessarily criminal taken alone, but as a pattern, consistent, documented, spanning 6 years of records, it painted a clear picture of a board that had come to treat organizational resources as a personal perk, confident that no one was ever going to look closely enough to notice. That confidence, it turned out, had an expiration date. Herschel prepared a financial summary document, 42 pages, color-coded by category. He was thorough in the way that only retired accountants who take financial impropriety personally can manage to be. Outside, December had gone properly cold. The lake wore a skin of morning frost that caught the early light like hammered silver. My remaining oaks stood dense and dark against a pale sky. I walked the property line most mornings, boots crunching over frozen grass, thermos warm in one hand, reading the land the way my grandfather had taught me to read it. Slow, careful, without rushing toward a conclusion. The hearing was 2 weeks out. 10 days before the hearing, the HOA's property management company reached out to Wade with a settlement offer. $22,000 for the trees, which was about 30% of what Cheryl Graves had documented, plus a mutual release of all claims, withdrawal of all regulatory filings, and a permanent easement granting the pipeline route in perpetuity. In exchange, they were offering HOA dues credits on a neighboring parcel I didn't own and had never had any interest in. Wade sent 2 sentences back. My client is not interested in settlement at this time. We will see you at the hearing. I had thought seriously about whether to settle. I'm not, by nature, a man who enjoys conflict. I built this property to be a quiet place. I liked my mornings. I liked the sound of the lake at first light and the smell of cedar after rain, and the way the oaks looked against the winter sky. None of that had anything to do with legal filings and depositions. But I'd watched my trees come down without my consent. I'd watched my property title get deliberately clouded. I'd watched 90 families get led, without their meaningful knowledge or vote, into a chain of decisions that had already cost them real money and was about to cost them considerably more. Those families hadn't voted for any of this. They'd paid their assessments in good faith. Most of them just wanted their water to work and their lives to be peaceful. They were inside the same machine I was fighting. They just couldn't see it from where they were standing. The week before the hearing, Gail Murchison published her follow-up piece. She had obtained, through a public records request, the written documentation of Brenda's conversation with Commissioner Polk's staffer. She reported that the county attorney had confirmed the matter had been referred to the county ethics board for review. Polk declined to comment. The story ran on a Thursday morning. By Friday afternoon, 3 HOA board members had requested an emergency meeting. 2 of them had quietly retained personal legal counsel. Brenda did not step down. She convened the meeting and argued that the newspaper story was a coordinated attack, that Gail Murchison was operating with a bias, and that the ethics board complaint was entirely without merit. She had prepared a 6-page written rebuttal that she read aloud in full, a document that contained several grammatical errors uncharacteristic of someone who communicated, as a rule, with the precision of a well-maintained filing system. She had apparently written it very late at night. 2 board members voted to formally table the rebuttal without entering it into the record. One of them looked at Brenda and said, directly and without raising his voice, that she needed to stop talking and start listening. Brenda had not been spoken to this way in recent memory. She didn't respond well to it. Meanwhile, I was finalizing the offer I planned to present at the public hearing. I had been building it carefully with Claudette Riggs over several working sessions, testing each element for legal enforceability and practical fairness. Claudette had the calm, unhurried precision of someone who has seen every variation of a water rights dispute and knows exactly how each one ends if it goes all the way through litigation. The offer was structured as follows. I would grant the pipeline easement, not as a permanent conveyance and not for free, as a revocable license agreement, renewable every 3 years with specific performance conditions. Those conditions were full restoration of my 3 trees at the appraised replacement value of $64,000, posted as a cash performance bond before any further construction. Annual independent water quality monitoring of Hargrove Lake at the HOA's expense. Immediate cessation of all regulatory complaints by the Ridgecrest Board against agricultural use properties in the county. And a comprehensive third-party financial audit of HOA funds going back 6 years, with complete results disclosed to the full membership. If any single condition was violated, I retained the right to revoke the license. Revocation would require the HOA to remove the pipeline infrastructure at their own expense within 90 days. This was a trap in the structural sense, not a dramatic physical reveal, but something more durable. Every condition looked reasonable in isolation. A fair-minded person reading the offer would see nothing punitive, but every condition was also a leash, and I held the other end of each one. The HOA could have their pipeline and their water and their peaceful subdivision, but they would have it on terms I set, under scrutiny they'd never faced before, and with the knowledge that the moment they overreached again, the whole thing came apart. Claudette called it elegant. Prentice, who had the engineer's appreciation for structures that do exactly what they're designed to do, called it surgical. Orvella, who had been working land in this county for 30-plus years and had limited patience for anything but plain language, said it was the most satisfying thing she'd witnessed since the IRS audited her neighbor who'd tried to steal her fence line back in 2009. The morning of the hearing, I put on the good jacket, dark blue wool my daughter gave me 2 Christmases ago, the one I save for occasions that matter. Drove the 40 minutes to the county seat with coffee and a thermos and a folder of documents I genuinely hoped I wouldn't need to open. Everything that needed to be said was already on record. All I had to do was show up and let the weight of it do its work. The county commissioner's hearing room seats about 120 people on a normal day. On January 14th, it was standing room only, with people backed into the hallway where someone had propped the door open with a metal folding chair. The room smelled of coffee from a table someone had set up near the back entrance, and, faintly, of the cedar smoke that settles over the whole hill country in the depths of winter. Gail Murchison was in the second row with a notebook and a photographer. A reporter from the San Antonio Express-News had made the drive up after following her coverage for weeks. 2 county attorneys sat at the side table with their files open. Commissioner Polk was at the far end of the dais, present because he had to be, and visibly reconsidering a great number of his recent life decisions. Brenda arrived with Clifton Beale, her HOA attorney. Expensive suit, the expression of a man accustomed to winning on procedural grounds before the other side understands what's happening. Brenda took her seat at the respondents' table and did not acknowledge me when I walked in. She had assembled the careful composure of someone performing calm rather than actually feeling it, the kind of stillness that takes visible effort to maintain. I sat down with Wade on my left and Claudette on my right, set my thermos on the floor next to my chair, put the document folder on the table, folded my hands. Several people who were in that room later told me I looked like a man waiting for a connecting flight, unbothered, entirely patient. The county administrator opened the proceedings and presented the infrastructure dispute in the careful, neutral language of someone who is paid to represent no position. Then Wade was recognized, and he walked through the full case in 13 minutes flat. The civil suit, the arborist appraisal, Rupert Oakes's survey, the 1961 deed language establishing private water rights, the agency filings, the CC&R supermajority requirement. Every sentence was a document. Every claim had a corresponding exhibit number. Clifton began his response by arguing that my water rights claim was an interpretation that had never been adjudicated and should therefore be treated as speculative until a court ruled on it. He was 3 minutes into this when the county counsel interrupted, not aggressively, simply with the precision of someone who had done her own reading, and noted for the record that the 1961 conveyance was not an interpretive question. It was a recorded instrument that the county's own review had already confirmed as valid. The document said what it said. Clifton pivoted to community need, 90 families, water infrastructure, public health implications if the project was delayed through summer. He was persuasive on this point because it was genuinely true. Those families did need water infrastructure, and I had never disputed that. What I had disputed, from the very first certified letter, was the method. Unauthorized tree removal, fraudulent easement assertions, regulatory harassment of agricultural neighbors. A board resolution passed with 3 votes when 69 were required. Wade stood up and placed Prentice's 42-page pattern of regulatory overreach report on the table, set Herschel's color-coded financial summary on top of it. He didn't present them. He set them down where they were visible to the board, the county attorneys, the reporters, and the room. The photographer got a clean shot. Then Claudette presented my offer. She walked through every condition methodically and without haste. The the water quality monitoring, the tree restoration bond, the audit, the revocable license structure, the renewal terms. When she finished, she said, "Mr. Hargrove's position is straightforward. The subdivision should have its water pipeline. He has never opposed the project's existence. He has opposed the method by which it was pursued, and he is offering a structured path forward that protects the community's interests, along with his own." The room absorbed this in the particular quiet of people processing something collectively. It lasted about 15 seconds. Brenda broke it. She stood up, which she was not recognized to do, and said, loudly enough that it carried clearly into the hallway, "This is extortion. He is holding 90 families hostage over a patch of water and 3 trees that were in the way of critical infrastructure." Clifton put a hand firmly on her arm. She didn't sit down. Commissioner Polk raised his gavel and asked all parties to observe hearing protocol. Wade, who had remained seated throughout, reached into his folder and removed a single sheet of paper I had not seen before. He held it for a moment, then spoke in the unhurried tone of a man who has been waiting for exactly this specific moment, for exactly this long. "If it would assist the board in understanding the full context of this dispute, I'd like to submit into the record the documented conversation between Ms. Thatch and the Office of Commissioner Polk, currently under active review by the County Ethics Board. It speaks directly and clearly to the question of who, in this proceeding, has been applying pressure to whom." He slid the paper across the table toward the county administrator. Gail's photographer got the shot. Commissioner Polk went very still. Brenda sat down. The hearing ran another 90 minutes. The commissioners voted 4-1 to approve a 60-day supervised mediation period, during which the HOA and I would negotiate final terms of the license agreement under county oversight. Commissioner Polk cast the single dissenting vote, then left the building through a side exit without speaking to anyone. In the hallway outside the hearing room, Orvella found me and shook my hand for a long time, without saying anything at all. That handshake, I will tell you honestly, was the best part of the entire day. The mediation ran 38 days, faster than anyone predicted. Brenda was not at the table. The board had voted, in a 2/3 majority, to suspend her from executive authority pending the Ethics Board review and the outcome of the civil proceedings. Her replacement as temporary board president was a man named Gordy Axtell, a retired high school history teacher who had bought into the subdivision 3 years earlier and who approached the negotiation process with a patience, intellectual honesty, and basic human decency that made the previous 6 months feel like a prolonged fever dream. Gordy and I got along immediately. I think we both understood, without having to say it directly, that neither of us had wanted any of this. The license agreement was signed on February 27th. The pipeline got its easement and its route. I got the tree restoration bond, $64,000 posted in escrow, to be released upon completion of professionally installed replacement plantings that I selected myself with Cheryl Graves's guidance. 3 native red oaks and 2 live oaks went into the ground that March, chosen for rootstock health and long-term site compatibility. They were small, as young trees always are, but they were in the soil, and that's where they'll stay. The third-party financial audit was completed in March and delivered to the full HOA membership, in a meeting that Gordy ran with careful transparency. The audit identified $73,000 in expenditures that could not be verified as legitimate HOA business expenses. The board voted unanimously to refer the findings to the county district attorney's office for review. The county ethics board issued a formal reprimand to Commissioner Polk and referred his conduct for additional review by the state. Clifton Beal did not seek renewal of his county infrastructure consulting contract. Brenda Thatch submitted her resignation from the HOA board in April, in a letter to the membership describing her tenure as passionate and misunderstood. The membership received this characterization with the particular equanimity of people who had just received partial refunds on an improperly collected assessment. The 90 homeowners who had paid the unauthorized special assessment filed a separate civil action against the former board members in their personal capacities. I wasn't a party to that suit. I watched it from a distance with the detached interest of someone who has already gotten what they came for. What I think about most, looking back on all of it, is the 90 families. They didn't build this mess. Most of them just wanted their water to work and their neighborhood to function peacefully. They had been caught inside a machine built by someone else's ego, subject to the same arbitrary power as the rural landowners on the outside, just from a different angle. The new board, under Gordy's leadership, reached out to Orvella and Prentice's rural landowner group and proposed something that I think would have prevented most of this if it had existed from the start. A monthly open meeting between subdivision residents and neighboring agricultural property holders, for the purpose of surfacing friction early and finding practical accommodations before anything reached the level of a regulatory action or a lawsuit. It's been running for 2 years now. It actually works. For my part, I added one element that wasn't in the license agreement, completely my own initiative, negotiated separately. I dedicated 5 acres of my property, bordering the lake, to a conservation easement held by the County Land Trust, protecting it from any future development in perpetuity. The easement includes structured public educational access for school groups studying local ecology, watershed management, and land stewardship. And I established a $3,000 annual scholarship for graduating seniors at the local high school, pursuing degrees in environmental science, land management, or agricultural studies. I funded the scholarship using part of the tree restoration bond repayment. That detail gives me a quiet satisfaction. I won't pretend otherwise. The lake is still there. The spring still fills it every summer the way it always has. The new oaks are coming up slowly, the way good things do. The pipeline runs along the southern bank and has performed without issue since the design correction. The correction Prentice identified, the one the mandatory county review required the contractor to fix. The subdivision has its water. I have my land. And everyone who needed to understand what happens when you mistake someone's patience for weakness has had that lesson explained to them in considerable detail. Most mornings I'm still out before sunrise, boots on, thermos in hand, walking the fence line in the cold gray light while the lake holds the dark a little longer than the sky does. The new trees are out there, small but present, rooted. That's enough.
So that's how it ended. Brenda had 3 votes. She needed 69, 3 cheers, $64,000, 1 deed clause from 1961 that nobody bothered to read. Here's what I want you to take away from Court's story, and it's not fight your HOA. It's this. The people who win these fights don't win because they are angrier. They win because they are more prepared. Court didn't do anything dramatic. He read his deed, he hired the right surveyor, he filed the right paperwork with the right agency. He let the other side keep moving and documented every step they took. 3 legal tools did all the work. A formal easement denial letter that stopped the adverse crop code, a tree appraisal using the CTLA methodology, industry standard, court admissible, and the CCNR supermajority clause that had been sitting in the HOA's own documents since 2006, completely ignored. None of that required a lawyer on day one. It required reading. If you own property, any property, pull your deed this week, look for water rights language. Look at your HOAs, CCNRs, and find default thresholds for infrastructure projects. Most people never look until it's too late. Court looked, and that's the whole story. If this helped you, or if you got your own HOA story, drop it in the comments. I read everyone. Subscribe to HOA Stories, new video every week. And remember, they can't use your ignorance against you if you refuse to stay ignorant.